Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar event. Thank you, Dr. Duncan, for kind enough to accept our invitation and presenting today. And we have even more exciting webinar events planned in the future, so please look forward to those. And Dr. Susan Duncan has studied milk sensory quality and consumer perception throughout her career. In recent years, she has directed her inquiry towards discoveries of how emotions influence perception of food quality. Her goal is to increase fluid milk consumption in the U.S. to influence the health and well-being of Americans and the global population. Dr. Duncan, who served as 2015 to 2016 ADSA President, is a Professor of Food Science and Technology and Associate Director of Virginia Agricultural Experiment Station at Virginia Tech. And with no delay, I would like to ask Dr. Duncan to take over the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Duncan.
Thank you, and I appreciate all that are on the call, and I hope that as we go through the conversation today that you all get something out of this, either both on the professional level as well as personally. My goal is to help you understand how the dairy industry can engage with the consumers and how consumers have some decision processes within them that they may not even understand as to how they're responding to milk products. So I named this particular presentation Driving Miss Dairy, and that's based on the 1989 movie Driving Miss Daisy, so I thought that was kind of a fun relationship name type of thing, but also because in that movie there was a scene that I found to be very reminiscent of what I want to talk about. So if you're not familiar with the movie, I'll just kind of recap that for you. It's an older woman who's lost her driving privileges, and she's being asked to give up her independence by having an assigned driver to her. So she now has to recognize that she's going to be escorted around by someone who has control over her ability to go somewhere. And she's resistant to that change. And so at one point before she's fully decided to adopt this new change, she decides to go to the store, and she's walking along the sidewalk. And following her on the road is this gentleman driving the car, and he's driving very, very slowly right behind her. And she looks over to him and she says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm trying to drive you to the store." And the reason I find this to be captivating is because we in the dairy industry are needing to have people who are willing to go to the store and buy our products, and then to use those products and come back and buy them again. And sometimes a resistance to change makes it really hard to get to where we want to go. And so I bring that to you as we start to navigate through this presentation, which apparently I'm not able to do. There we go. And so I want to start off by saying we as an industry do a lot of things really well. We produce an abundant supply of milk that can really surpass what the actual needs are, that the processed fluid milk that we do manufacture has a longer shelf life now, even for the high temperature short time products, that we've ever had before. So it's under refrigerated shelf life, we're exceeding 20 days. Our code dates are often at 18 to 21 days, which is longer than has been historically standard. And we are meeting and surpassing the regulatory standards. So we do that extremely well. We also are delivering a highly nutritious product, and one that is recognized as valuable to the human diet. So it's understood by most consumers that milk is an important aspect of their diet. And consumers can find the milk. It's in the grocery store, it's right under the label dairy, it's in convenience markets, it's available. So then the question becomes, what's the problem? And one of the things that I think you all know is that milk consumption is declining. So milk consumption declining means that who's really in charge? Who's driving Miss Dairy? And that's something that really, from my perspective, is not any single segment of the dairy industry's responsibility. It's a responsibility that comes from all of us to understand the role the consumer has in our industry. I'll point out a illustration that you may understand, but you might not have seen directly. This is a USDA ERS, Economic Research Service, graph of the per capita daily fluid milk consumption. And it expands from 1970 to 2010, and it illustrates a significant decline in whole milk consumption and a general increase over that same time frame of increased consumption of lower fat milk. But notice that even though there's been an increase as the other decreases, that the overall trend in fluid milk consumption declined substantially. Now, for many of you, if you're in the undergraduate or graduate age bracket right now, you probably don't see a big change in terms of the time frame that you've lived. But if you look back over the 45 years from where 1970 was to where we're at now, you can see this big change, and it's actually a 37% decrease in the per capita consumption on a daily basis. And that's a large decrease for an industry that's trying to sell milk. So one of the other aspects I want to point out to you is that even in 1970, the number of 8-ounce cups per day was less than 1 on an individual basis. So even though the recommendation for the number of servings of fluid milk per day is 3 cups for an adult per day, that's 24 ounces, it means that we aren't even coming close to that even in 1970. And the fact that we've decreased to about 0.6 cups per day is not showing us the opportunity to grow. So our question is, how do we reverse this decline? How do we reverse this trend? And whose job is that? I challenge all of us to be involved in reversing this trend. And we're consumers, so therefore we also should be empathetic to what the consumer experience is. Uh-oh, sorry. Don't know what I just did. There we go. And so this is another just graphical representation of that relationship. On the bottom line is just the cups of milk consumed per day, per person, and the number of gallons per month that that person would then consume. So from the ERS data, if someone's only consuming 0.6 cups per day, they're only going to consume about a gallon of milk per month. Whereas if they're consuming the recommended number of servings of 3, they would consume almost 6 gallons per month. That's a huge amount of milk we could be selling that we are not. And that's detrimental to us because we're not meeting the potential market. We're not having a market to meet. Conversely, if we translate that to what the consumer's experiencing, when we look at that 0.6 cups per day of consumption, and we think about how long that gallon's going to be in their refrigerator, now we're looking at this gallon of milk that they purchased is going to be in their refrigerator for over 25 days, 26, 27 days. Now what have I just said? I've just said that we have pushed the milk from the point of fresh to where it's actually past code date and it's still in their refrigerator. What's the probability that they're going to have a positive sensory experience and have a lingering positive emotional experience when they're drinking that last little bit of milk that they paid for, that they want to use, and it might be past code date and have other challenges now that do not relate to what we want them to experience. So keeping that in mind and saying, wow, we really want every person to drink 3 cups of milk a day for their health benefit, and if they do that, they're going to be also getting almost a fresh milk from that whole gallon because it will be consumed within 5 to 7 days. So they're going to have a good quality product every time they consume it because it will be turned over very rapidly. I also point out that the average American over the course of the year is going to drink about 20 gallons of milk because they're drinking less than a cup a day. but they're going to drink far more carbonated beverages, bottled water, and beer than they do milk. So they're choosing to drink something, but what they're drinking are things that could also be shelf-stable and not require refrigeration. But these are also products that don't have the nutritional value that the milk product does. So we are competing as we work with our milk product, not as a commodity any longer. It's not a place where there's just a requirement for us to have milk in the refrigerator because we're going to drink it, our children are going to drink it, and we're going to have a requirement to have milk in the fridge. We're actually competing for our refrigerator space, our cupboard space, for all these beverages. And we're not a commodity, we are a beverage system when we talk about fluid milk. But have we acted like a beverage company? Are our dairy processors considering themselves to be beverage competitors, or are they still thinking as a commodity? In this process of why consumers are choosing which beverage they're going to have, which one they're going to drink, they don't always use rational thought to make these choices. So rational thought would say, here's the logic. I can have a nutritious product. I get more for my dollar because I have all these nutrients within this product. I have a product that's going to last for a couple weeks if I keep it cold and in the refrigerator, and I'm going to do good things for all of my family because I choose this product. That doesn't necessarily make logical, even though it's logical, it's not what their behaviors illustrate, because they are choosing water, which is good for them, but doesn't have the nutritional value. They're going to have sugar-sweetened beverages, which might have pleasure associated with it, but not in calories, but not necessarily nutrition. And they're also going to potentially drink beer, which has a lot of social benefit. So while we have traditionally measured whether a product will be successful just based on the acceptability of that product, acceptability does not equal purchase and consumption. So we point out that that's no longer sufficient rating type of method. What is it that's been driving the consumer? In recent years, there's been a high level of interest in the food industry about how consumers are responding to products in a way in addition to just their logic or rational thought. And the exploration of emotions has escalated quite rapidly. For many years, the psychology field has studied emotions, and they have a number of tools that are available through their experiences, through their knowledge and what they have learned about emotions. But the application to food or beverages and how people respond to those and how that influences their choice is relatively a new area of exploration. But what we do know from the psychology research is that emotions influence and reveal behavior. And this is very important to us as we pursue how to change the way consumers engage with fluid milk and other dairy products for that matter. So over the next few minutes, what I want to do is help you get an understanding of what emotion means in terms of the scientific understanding and how it relates from experiential kind of context. So the context of an emotion is that, that there are several components. And these are general language terms. There's a lot more science behind all these terminologies. But the first is that there's a feeling component associated with an emotion. And a lot of times we use feeling and emotion, mood, as the same term because they have been used interchangeably in just the lay language. But there are distinctions to that. So feeling is a component of an emotion, but an emotion is more than just the feeling. There's actually a cognitive element associated with emotion too, and that's that thinking component. That's the part that is going to help us somehow translate what we're saying or what we're feeling. And there's also an action component. And the initial action component might be a motor expression, or it might be hand waving. It might be actually a behavior, whether that's a flight or fight type of response, or some other less extreme action. And then there's also the element of the stimuli. And in our case, we're talking about the food or the beverage, milk specifically. And that sensory component includes all of those relationships on the physiological side, but also what the stimuli is doing to our physiological senses. So we have to have a stimuli for an emotion to really occur. And that doesn't have to be a food. Emotion in the broader context could be the visual of seeing a puppy or a tragic car accident, which is where a lot of the psychology research came to, having much greater and deeper emotional connection than what we might be able to measure with food. So to help it move this a little more completely for you to have a greater understanding, I want to describe to you this network that connects very rapidly for someone during the process of having a response to food. And this includes three broad areas. One is the influences that might affect our perception of the food. The other being the perception and communicative responses within our systems itself that then translates into what we might cognitively or not be able to even acknowledge as our emotional response to food. Those influences that might occur on our perception of food include the health status of the individual, the consumer, their personal attributes in terms of characteristic, the stimuli around us, the environment, and the characteristics of the sensory characteristics of that food itself. And a few things that help further define those is for that health status, it might be whether you're approaching or engaging with the food product, the beverage, the milk, when you're hungry versus when you're full, whether you've been dieting, whether you're highly stressed. So these are kinds of situations, but alternatively, it's also about what your background is, whether your culture allowed you to have milk, whether or not when you were a child your parents forced something like milk on you, or whether your school system provided a good environment for you to have a memory, a social experience associated with that early opportunity to engage in a fluid milk product. The sensory characteristics are also important. We mentioned those already, but the fact that we have the basic sensory concepts of texture, taste, odor, etc., the temperature at which it's served, whether the ingredients are natural, organic, or some other descriptor, high quality, and then just the whole perception of those attributes. Does that mean that the milk is going to be fresh? Does that mean it's going to be safe? And finally, just the environment in which you're choosing to consume that product. The lighting, again, the ambiance of the space, whether or not we're comfortable with the people we're with. How does that relate to our experience with the food? These combinations of things are going to be influential on that cognitive expression of whether or not we've enjoyed the food product. Simultaneously going on is how we're integrating all of these influences within ourselves. So we have a neurologic signaling that's happening through physiological response, which is allowing our action tendency, our expressions to possibly change, energy that we might be illustrating through our body as well, and then the opportunity to put all that together in some kind of a knowledge, a cognitive expression. And so this integration is not linear. We actually have, as we decide what our emotions are associated with food, if we even think about that, it's continually being changed and integrated back and forth as a new sense, a new aspect of that food experience influences a different physiological response that might lead to some cognitive recognition. So how do we measure our, as a consumer, response to a food? Most of the time, historically, we have used a hedonic scale. So probably all of you have had an opportunity to express whether you thought a product was acceptable or not using a hedonic scale. And typically those are using a 9-point category scale with 1 maybe meaning dislike extremely as the language and 9 meaning like extremely. This could also be a 7-point scale or 11-point scale. It's not restricted to a 9-point scale, though that's most common. This has been the first way that we've measured acceptability, and it's been our traditional approach. It's been based on what the military did back in the 1940s when they created the scale and used it to test how soldiers were responding to the food sources that they were serving them in the field. Fast forward to all this time till about 2010, and then there were the development furthering what psychology researchers have already done on using a ballot system associated with emotions. And that ballot system is a list of emotional language that might be something someone cognitively identified as being an emotion associated with the stimuli, in this case milk, food, or beverages. The concept of a check all that apply is you look at this list, and while you're in that experiential moment, you check every term there that you have seen that seems to reflect what you're feeling. So you have a cognitive expression of something that's very complex going on within you. The difference between this profile that I'm showing you on the screen versus what psychology has traditionally used is that psychologists tend to use a ballot that has a lot of what I'll call negative language on there, so many less positive or with intense experiential kinds of emotions that could be very negative perceptively. Whereas with food, most of the time our food experiences are very positive. So the example shown here is related to a number of research experiences done at McCormick at Spices, and they have identified that this list of words are appropriate for foods that are of good quality. So you see a lot more positive. It's not as balanced, or it's not as heavily weighted towards negative language. Another method that's just in the really investigative stages is the use of software that codes the relationship between how your face moves to one of the basic emotions. And so we have labeled that as automated facial expression analysis, and it requires the visual capture using video of someone going through the experience of consuming the product, beverage in this case, and then how the computer can analyze the 500 points on their face that are moving in relation to that stimuli. This movement then, in all these regions of the face, are translated through algorithms into 6 categories that are identified as basic emotions. Those include anger, happy, disgust, sad, scared, and surprised. These 6 basic emotions were identified through psychological research over a course of many years and have become standardized as the language of basic emotions. The software also categorizes a neutral state, which suggests that none of these emotions are coming at a very high level at all. And so in this analysis, the space mask that you see on the screen is the relationship where they're measuring the change in distance from one point to another, and then that is translated into this algorithm that then can be categorized as one of these basic emotions and expressed on a scale of 0 to 1. So we get actual data that illustrates how much or how intense that change in it, that expression is identified. Psychological researchers also use measures of neural activity, and that includes EEG, and physiological activity, which includes the ECG. In our research, we have worked with the folks in psychology to bring these tools and measures to us, or we go to them. So it's just kind of one of those cool things that I couldn't do this in my lab if it weren't for partnerships. And I really appreciate the folks that are helping us do this kind of exploration. So when we're exploring what the brain is doing in relation to the experience of engaging with a food product, we're going to, in our research, study the relationship between what the right and the left hemispheres of the brain are doing. And we use this with electrodes that are positioned at the frontal cortex, which is related to emotional responses and motivational behavior tendencies. There's a number of electrodes that are placed all over the brain. Our particular interests were on the F3 and the F4 categories or electrodes, and that's because the left frontal cortex at the F3 has an indication of approach motivational behaviors, which could be translated to the basic emotions of anger, happy, and surprised. The right frontal cortex is an indication of pulling back or withdrawing motivational behaviors, and that includes the descriptors or basic emotions called disgust, sad, and scared. So the idea is that if one side of the brain, left for example, has a higher response rate under the conditions of the measurement, then we might be able to say the person is willing to approach or having an approaching kind of thing, but it doesn't tell us what kind of emotion is actually experienced. The ECG is a physiological measure, and it's talking about how fast your heartbeat responds to the number or to the stimuli. Again, with many of the psychology experiments, they have actually put you in a position or put the participant in a position where they're going to experience something very intense. But food is a lot less intense. So we're actually measuring something in our lab that has a response to it, but not necessarily at the intensity level that would be common in most of the past experiences. So an illustration of how it could be interpreted, or how heart rate could be interpreted, is that if the heart starts beating at a more rapid rate, it might be an indication that the person is experiencing some level of anger, maybe an imaginary contentment, disgust, like from a contamination source, or fear. There's also the positive other aspects here of happiness, joy, and surprise. And so what you can tell is we see an increase in heart rate, but we don't know what emotion we're actually experiencing. To confound this further is that if we see a decrease in heart rate, we're going to get, again, some positive and some not so positive or more of a withdrawal kind of response. But all we know is that it's a decrease in heart rate. We have to be able to interpret this in some way, and it's really challenging to know whether or not this is a positive decrease or something associated with something like a disgust because something is very intense, maybe a mutilation kind of thing, which just frightens me to think about. But if you're thinking about a slaughter situation, that could be an example of where we get a disgust kind of response. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is walk you through some examples of our research where we have measured either from an explicit or that cognitive response that people can share with us about some of their experiences using milk as the stimuli, and where we've integrated then in our further exploration some of the motor expression using the automated facial expression analysis and the physiological measures and neurological measures using EEG and ECG. I've broken those into three examples, and I call them in an attempt to make this kind of how the consumer might respond to them. For the love of chocolate milk, which is focused on the issue of whether chocolate milk should be part of a dietary program or a USDA school food service program because of the question about calories. The fresh milk frustration, which deals with how the consumer's first experience or their experience with a product that they just purchased, milk, from the retail store, and whether or not they see it as fresh. And then fear of the milk chunk, which is kind of that anticipatory, what's going to happen if my milk is in my refrigerator for a long time, and am I going to have a problem with it? Am I going to be satisfied with it when I finally get a chance to consume it? So we'll start initially with this concept of the controversy associated with chocolate milk. When I was a kid, chocolate milk was in the school. It was a great experience. I loved drinking the chocolate milk. And why? Because it was sweet and it did have flavor. And it was different than what I got at home. So I was really pleased to be able to have chocolate milk in my school. It gives me a positive memory. In today's society, sugar-sweetened beverages, though, are very much getting a lot of negative publicity. And chocolate milk is getting captured in that conversation. So the word milk is associated with it. The fact that the child might appreciate the milk, the chocolate milk flavor, and the sweetness that's associated with it, but because it's there's concern associated with it, they may hear expressions from their teachers, from the school food service, from their own parents that are saying, you can't drink chocolate milk's bad for you. And other language that would suggest that here's something they enjoy, but now it has a negative language associated with it. Now, down at North Carolina State University, they did do a study associated with how parents perceive chocolate milk and whether or not they think it's appropriate for their child. And just as a quick summary of that, there was evidence that parents understand chocolate milk has a large health value, nutritional value, but there is concern about the sweeteners and the source of sweeteners that are in the chocolate milk and the extra calories. But while that's there, they also use very positive emotional language associated with chocolate milk. So the bigger thing that drives their decision process is that if the child loves chocolate milk or likes it very, very much, then that parent probably is going to consider buying chocolate milk for their child. But it is also going to need to have the label, the nutritional content, maybe less sweeteners, maybe an appropriate class of sweeteners, maybe natural ingredients and not artificial ingredients. These may weigh into that, and that'll be part of their decision process as long as they know the child's going to drink it. And these other parameters of the product are valuable for them. So it's a combination for what the parent's influence is going to be on that chocolate milk experience. Again, the concept that acceptance doesn't mean consumption is followed in by our own research. We used undergraduate students in a research laboratory setting, a classroom setting actually, where they tasted chocolate milk and white milk, and these were products that were purchased right from the retail store. And we asked them to give us a response on a hedonic scale, and then to use that check all that apply ballot to identify which emotions they would pick out associated with tasting their chocolate milk experience. And then when they tasted the white milk, which emotions did they experience? So using that cognitive expression, we captured that the chocolate milk was received a hedonic score of about 7, so very well liked, or liked moderately, which is about what you expect for a traditionally successful product. When we look at the list of terms that were frequently selected in that product, what we found was these are very high energy and terms that illustrate a very satisfying kind of experience. So you looked at the word happy, at the word nostalgic, and you recognize that this is an association that the students experienced, these students that are making their early independent decisions about whether they're going to choose a product. And they found a lot of value, a lot of satisfaction in consuming chocolate milk. The white milk experience was slightly different. This product had a lower hedonic score. It was about a 5.4, right above neither like nor dislike on our scale that we used. And while we found a lot of low energy, positive language associated with the white milk, we also started seeing the evidence that some of those withdrawal terms or negative terms were also being selected, disgusted and bored being illustrated on this figure. So once we see that, what we can tell is, while white milk does have positive attributes to it from an emotional standpoint, a cognitive process, it's undermined by the fact that there are some other language that's coming out with higher frequency than we would like to see on this product. This product was purchased from the retail store in a traditional package of high-density polyethylene, or HDPE, and a translucent package. It is the product that most consumers are going to experience. And because of that, we are now a little more thoughtful about what is that emotional experience that that person is going to have when they taste the white milk. So in summary, from this particular project, what we came about with was, one, we think chocolate milk should be in the schools. I think chocolate milk should be in the schools because I want the word milk associated with a positive sensory experience, and I would really like the debate to kind of just fade away, but that's my personal bias. But white milk is maybe needing some additional support, something that's going to help change the way people perceive it. And right now, this particular list is based on the sensory aspects of it, as well as all of those background influences that we were talking about. So as we took this work a little further, we wanted to explore what is going on with that first experience with the milk. What is that they're getting when they purchase, when a consumer purchases a fresh milk right out of the retail case that has been stored under those traditional conditions. There's been tons of research, of which I've spent my career as well, looking at the implications of light intensity, type of light, packaging as a barrier to light on milk quality from the nutritional and chemical nature, and how that leads to off flavors. That's not new research. It's just adding more depth to that question. But what hasn't been explored before is the role that this chemical change is creating that is introducing sensory quality that influences the underlying emotions that might have an effect on whether consumers are coming back to buy that product. And so that's what I'm going to share with you next. Well, I'll back up and say this particular project has been published, so if you're interested in it, you can look it up from Food Research International. The setup was that we took milk that had never been put into a retail case. It was received directly from the dairy section of the store, but while it was just delivered from the processing plant. And it was in high-density polyethylene gallon jugs. We put it under the conditions of a fluorescent lighting situation and the same condition but with a light-blocking foil wrap over top of it. And we stored it for 8 hours, 72 hours, 168 hours. What this graph is illustrating to you is that hedonic score, that when we protect milk from light, we maintain a very high level of acceptability over a whole week of time frame. Alternatively, if we allow the milk to be in a retail case that has lighting without appropriate light block in the package, we already are seeing after 8 hours, and its time frame is much shorter than that actually, a decrease in the acceptability of the milk. So if we put that in context, most consumers are buying milk that has been stored for at least 2 hours and probably more like 4 to 8 hours and maybe longer, and they're getting a product that has already been changed and affects their acceptability. Now, when we captured how they used the cognitive expression of emotions, what we see was that there were a lot of positive language that was being used, but the longer that the milk was exposed to light, the more instance there was of the term disgust. So that if we had the extreme condition of milk sitting under the conditions of light for a long period of time, disgust becomes a very prevalent characteristic. The graph on the right, a spider graph or radar plot, just illustrates to you for each of those terms that were frequently selected for the products, the frequency of selection for each of those conditions: light protected after 8 hours, light protected after, or light exposed for 8 hours, and then the condition, light exposed condition for 72 or 7 days, 72 hours or 7 days. And as you can see, even after 8 hours, what we saw were not that the change of emotional selection was very, very much different, but it was diminished. People were already starting to have less of a positive experience, thus in support of that decreased hedonic score. And when we got to 72 hours, you can see that it's much lower. So a longer exposure to light is influencing not just the acceptability, but the underlying measure of emotions that might be a longer-term memory and information that that consumer is going to remember when it's time to go back and decide if they're going to buy more milk. If you keep it in there for a long point and the word disgusted shows up, then we're really in trouble, because that's going to be a I'm not going to that experience again kind of condition. And also, we were video recording the face as the individuals were tasting the milk. And at this early stage of our exploration of facial expression analysis, we weren't sure how to use the data. So I'm presenting to you here a graphic image of those 6 basic emotions plus the neutral state as a summary graph, pie chart graph, of what the percentage of that expression was over the time frame of, I think it was 15 seconds. The big takeaway here is this particular assessment is illustrating just how diverse the consumer population is. So if I only took one of these examples and tried to tell you what the expression or what the emotional relationship is and related it to all consumers, I would be really extending something in an inaccurate way. All of us are different. All of us come with a number of background and cultural, et cetera, kinds of conditions. So we're all going to have a different response. So the use of this tool has to come from an estimate of a population and not necessarily just on the individual level. So the point of this being is that fresh milk experience is illustrating to us that this light exposure has an effect. It has an effect that is diminishing the quality of that product. Consumers are noticing it, and it's creating an emotional relationship that's very diminishing to their overall satisfaction of the product. I have very little time left to really talk about this last part, so I'm going to move through it pretty quickly, even though it's really fun to me. And that's now carrying that to what's the anticipatory part, or what's that potential? What would be happening if I try to drink the milk and I get a worst case experience? So this is creating that integration of how facial expressions and physiological and neurologic responses come about. And there's a little bit of research here that you can pull out. There's a couple that have come even more recently than when I put this together. But I'm just illustrating that to you so you can see that here's the most of what we have in food science related to the use of facial expression, those more implicit assessments. Our objective on this one was to bring that implicit relationship to the explicit, or those that were cognitively expressed responses. So we have the EEG, the ECG, and the facial expression in relation to their hedonic score and their check all that apply emotional. I'm going to only focus on that milk and flake cereal set here, but what I'm really illustrating to you is what the whole design of the experiment was. We used videos as the stimuli because we were actually conducting this project over in the psychology laboratory, and we had people, students, participating who would put on the EEG cap with all the electrodes. They would have a heart rate monitor on. They would be seated at a desk watching a video of each of these products, and we would be recording their face. So while that was going on, we were just collecting data. And then at the conclusion of the video, they would fill in the scorecard with their cognitive responses of hedonic response and the emotions. the videos were paired so that we had a control where we showed the pancake being placed on the plate, etc., with the fruit, etc., the milk being poured on the cereal, and the breakfast sandwich being built. And then they were each presented to the participant, so it looked like they were about to take a bite. There were also evented videos that were also shown. For example, the evented video for the pancake had a hair in it, so that was a hygiene issue. The one for the milk and cereal that I'll show you more data on has to do with the spoilage issue. And then the one for the breakfast sausage actually had a very rare or raw meat patty in it, so that was an illustration of safety. Focusing on the cereal and milk, what we can see is the control had, this is a 7-point scale, so 4 is the neither like nor dislike line. It had a positive experience, though still just moderately, like slightly kind of attitude, whereas as soon as they saw chunks, they definitely said it was lower. From the check all that apply emotional expression, the evented video, as you would expect, had a high number of disgust and worried selections, whereas the breakfast cereal itself was, again, a low energy but positive language types of emotional expression. Now this is where you actually see the videos, and simultaneously what you'll see on the graph is the line that happens, or the expression of each of these basic emotions over the 20-second period, 10 seconds before the event, which occurs at 0, and then 10 seconds after. And this line that's going to appear is actually the difference between the expression that occurred during the evented video and the expression that occurred during the control video. So you see the milk pouring on the left, and you can see on the lower one that there are big chunks like cottage cheese on their cereal, and they're about to get a serving of that presented to them. On the right, you see all of the emotions that are happening, or the difference in the emotions that are happening, and you can see that there's an orange line higher on the early segments and a red line that's lower on the latter part of the segments. And we've transferred that into another way of expression that illustrates that for the evented video, there was a higher or significantly different expression in sadness and in disgust after the event, whereas the control video had a higher expression of neutral, which is considered to be a positive aspect related to food. Simultaneously, we saw a decrease in heart rate, which is related to the sad expression and the facial expression, and we saw an activation of the right hemisphere, which is related to motivational behavior, so withdrawal. And that illustrates to us that they were actually experiencing a number of indicators that this event was really challenging them, and they were having an emotional, physiological, and neurological response to it. So the AFEA and the other measures are valuable to us to help further illustrate that somebody's experiencing something in a different way. And we want to help recognize that hedonic scale alone is not going to be enough information for us to really understand. But if we integrate the facial expression, the brain activity, heart rate, and our use of eye tracking with our explicit responses, we're probably going to know a whole lot more about what that person's response is to their fluid milk, or in this case, the picture is about macaroni and cheese. In summary, what I want you to walk away with, and I hope you have learned something personally and maybe something from a scientific perspective, is that the fluid milk beverage does create an emotional response to people, and they remember that emotional response. As a dairy industry, we're all responsible to making certain that people want to drink our milk, because we can't sell milk if people don't want it. We can't rely on the traditional message of it's good for you, or it's a staple for our kitchen, because those are just cognitive messages that don't necessarily tie in with behavior. And so we're not necessarily motivating them to repeat the purchase. We have to recognize that how the language of expression associated with our products is influential and how their experience with that product is experiential to their emotions is critical for us to build the connection with the consumers. We want them to trust us. We want them to believe that their milk is going to last a long time, but they're going to drink milk faster because they want more, and that's what we're really targeting. So having empathy or understanding of what this implicit emotion is that they're experiencing, even if they never tell us directly, if we believe that, if we do something to help enhance the positive aspects of their emotional experience, we can possibly motivate ourselves and others to choose fluid milk as part of their daily beverage. And with that, we're hoping that we can build a better consumer emotional relationship to milk, and that's going to help drive Miss Dairy. And with that, I feel that I have ended my presentation, and I hope that you all have some questions. I look forward to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan, for that. Dr. Duncan, I have one. When you're talking about chocolate milk, about your study comparing the chocolate milk with the normal milk, do you also think the perceptions change when you compare the full-fat milk with the skim milk? I mean, do you think the mouth feelness would also change, or how does that affect?
Well, there is some evidence, obviously, that the different fat content of unflavored milk affects a number of sensory characteristics, and we do know that that changes the acceptability score. With chocolate milk, you can have a lower fat product, but because there's stabilizers that can change the textural characteristics as well, the fat content might be less influential, but the quality of the cocoa, the aroma that flavoring system provides, whether or not the texture is reminiscent of a fat feeling or just a real slick, slippery kind of feeling, which is not characteristic of what a good product quality should be. I think those will all be sensory qualities that are going to potentially suggest or have an effect subtly, but those subtle things are what we're trying to elucidate. So yes, I think there will be an effect.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question coming from Carolina. What would be the best strategy to measure consumption behaviors and emotions in kids?
That's a great question. I think kids, especially the younger kids, are highly expressive and less able to control the way their face is expressed. The facial expression captures what they're truly feeling. So they are, however, less able to use verbal language, so it has to be very simplistic in terms of some of the words that we would use if we were asking them to fill in a scorecard of some nature. So I haven't worked with kids using the tools that we've just talked about, but my colleague in psychology, that's her lab. She does a huge amount of measurement on the EEG, the heart rate, and some other tools associated with how to interpret or assess what children are feeling. And I think that it's been highly effective. So adding in facial expression assessments as well would bring in another element, a level of that. It's expensive, and it's not necessarily expensive in the sense that it's tools that most people don't have available. And it's also something that you do need professionals that can work with the children so they feel secure and not scared about being in a lab setting with all these things tied up to them. So bottom line is a very simple scale with limited information you're going to get from a cognitive expression, and possibly, if you want more depth, working with professionals who can capture some of these other implicit measures of emotion would be helpful.
Thank you. Yes, and any more questions from attendees?
I can see some on my screen, so I'll try to, one from Dawn, and the question I see is, might the growing consumption of fermented milk products change the fear of the milk chunk question. That's a great one. And I don't know the answer to that. I do think that perceiving fermentation as a positive attribute is really important, and yet I also know that fermented milk in the products that are commonly perceived as good quality, we wouldn't expect to see chunks of milk in a Greek yogurt, for example. So the flavors might be more appropriate, but a controlled fermentation is going to lead you to positive flavors, whereas a fluid milk that spoils has a lot of negative flavors and the chunks, which look like cottage cheese, and cottage cheese does not have a huge fan base. So I'm not thinking we're going to get a huge swing just because we're increasing the positive aspects of fermented products. Another question that a great one. It says, how can you bring descriptive analysis data to further explain the consumer emotion? And I like that question. We have not used it for a descriptive sensory panel plus emotional analysis at the same time. We've been focusing on the consumer experience, which does not necessarily require the training that a descriptive panel has. But I think one of the values of the descriptive work is that it can tell us from a panel which flavors or textures or changes in the product are actually occurring that might be influencing what a consumer is responding to. So the parallel, to be able to use that might be very helpful. And then using a more in-depth statistical approach that integrates all of these different parameters might help point out which of those descriptive sensory qualities are also highly linked or influential to maybe some of these subtle emotions that are being captured. Another question that I see on here from Jason is, are we confusing consumers by having too many different choices in fluid milk? And he gives the fat-free, all the different fat contents, natural, organic, BST-free, raw, etc. And so they are buying beverages other than milk because they don't know what their milk choice should be. That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one, but I do think that some of our labels, especially when we get past the fat content level, they don't really differentiate between natural, organic, BST-free. They wouldn't know what raw milk means, I guess, but there's a lot of language that we use in the food industry that people assume it means something, and so they have a positive or negative association with this perception of what they think the word means, and they're not really legally defined in many cases. So fat content, I think, is pretty straightforward, although specific fat content level is not necessarily clear. But I don't know. They're pretty good at deciding whether they want to have Coke or Pepsi, so I don't know whether or not it's about the choice. And I think we'd lose someone if we only had full fat or if we only had skim milk available. So good question, though.
I have a couple of questions here to Dr. Duncan. Maybe you ask, how is the better way to access milk consumers when we want to know? So they wanted to know your opinion. I mean, how can you access milk consumers?
To gather some data associated with what they're thinking about the milk in terms of sensory quality or maybe attitudes towards the milk or something. There's a whole lot of effort going on now with the use of social media in relation to capturing real-time expression of the experience. And they're doing that a lot with marketing, advertising, programming, et cetera. And the food industry, the dairy industry could certainly capture some of that avenue for collecting data. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's one way that we could get more real-time and response in the actual use and buying experience is to be able to prompt them with some kind of tool and say, would you do this with us, and capture that data. There's a whole bunch of IRB responses that you have to have for that too, so that you get approval before you do it. But that's one way to do it.
Okay, I have another question asking about how close is the association between facial expression and buying behavior?
That's a good one. Some of our literature is actually, well, let me back up by saying I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows yet. But I do think that there has been enough evidence through the sales and marketing work that has been happening with the way people respond to commercials and other marketing strategies that illustrates that this is an important effort from industry to try to connect with their consumers. And they're doing it because they know that there's something deeper. The marketing professionals know that there's something deeper that they really want to connect with. That is obviously that first stage of the connection of a consumer to a product. The translation to whether or not it means something for the fluid milk industry or for the opportunity for the food industry in a broader scale to actually influence or understand what the buying behavior is more complex than just a simple taste this in the front of a sensory booth kind of question. It has a lot to do with what their expectations are when they're reaching into that dairy case and pulling that gallon of milk out, and whether or not that is validated when they get home, open the container, taste the product, have their family taste the product, experience that quality over the time frame that milk is in their home and they are using it, and then whether or not they have all of those influences that we talked about in that one figure, giving them positive feedback so that when they go back, they have built a positive memory, had a positive experience, they feel good about it, other people have expressed they feel good about it, and it motivates them to repeat it for that product and that brand. Do I have evidence of that? I haven't gotten to that level of knowledge from my own laboratory, but I do think that the pieces are being built in the larger puzzle to help illustrate that that's true.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Any more questions to come? I guess, okay, I think we are at the time too. And thank you again, Dr. Duncan, for taking your time and presenting a great webinar for us. And thank you all attendees. And we have planned, we have other exciting webinars planned in future as well. And please look forward for the emails and updates from our Facebook page or our email updates. And our ADSA GSP team is working hard to make this exciting. If we have no further questions, I would like to end this webinar now then.
And I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to thank you all for being excellent current and future ADSA members. Thanks for all your help. Have a great day.